Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today is going to be a heavy one. We are stepping into a time machine, going back about 20 years, to look at a book that is simultaneously a product of its time and I think a diagnostic manual for the confusion a lot of us feel right now.
We are looking at NeoConservatism, Why We Need It by Douglas Murray, and I have to say, just reading that title, I feel like half our audience might have just recoiled.
Oh, absolutely.
Neoconservatism is a loaded word. It's got baggage, it's got, a lot of scar tissue.
It really does. It's a term that has been used as a pejorative, a slur, and a badge of honor, often all in the same conversation. But that is exactly why we need to do this deep dive.
Right.
Our mission today isn't to relitigate the Iraq War or decide the 2004 election went the right way. We are not here to debate left versus right in that, that traditional sense.
No, we're here to look under the hood. We want to see the engine, the system.
Exactly. We are conducting a structural analysis of a specific argument. This whole deep dive is about examining how neoconservatism presents itself as a corrective system, a patch, if you will, for moral relativism and what Murray sees as political paralysis.
So we're looking at it as an ideological movement, how it functions as a stabilizing or maybe destabilizing system inside a liberal democracy.
That's the framework. We're looking at the design.
So if we strip away all the, the cable news footage of tanks in the desert, what is the core claim here? What is the system logic of this book?
The core claim is stark. It's really quite existential. Murray argues that when political institutions abandon shared moral frameworks, what philosophers might call natural right authority just fragments.
It breaks apart.
Completely.
Yeah.
And when you lose the ability to say this is good and this is bad with any real conviction, cultural cohesion erodes. And eventually, and this is the really chilling part, the civilization loses the will to survive.
Will to survive. That sounds less like politics and more like biology.
It is intended to be. The argument is that the West isn't just having a political disagreement. It's suffering from a crisis of perception. We've lost the ability to even see danger because we have, in a sense, deleted the software that allows us to judge reality.
Corrupted software. I like that analogy. Before we get into that, though, let's set the scene. Who is Douglas Murray in 2005? Because he's a massive public intellectual now, but back then...
He was incredibly young. I mean, he's born in 1979, so he's writing this book in his mid-20s.
Wow.
Yeah. He's a fresh graduate of Magdalen College, Oxford. And the book is published by the Social Affairs Unit, or the SAU.
The SAU, what's the significance of that?
It's a really important bit of context. The SAU was a think tank, but it wasn't, a typical party political one. It focused heavily on personal responsibility.
Sugar.
Their motto was argument over propaganda. So they were united by this idea that individuals, and by extension nations, have obligations, not just rights. So Murray is writing from this very specific high intellectual, but also deeply concerned vantage point.
And the year is 2005. Let's just, remember the vibe. 9/11 was 4 years ago. The Iraq War started in 2003, and it is getting very, very messy. The initial sort of unity of the West has completely fractured.
Utterly. And in the UK, where Murray is writing, the political landscape is completely dominated by Tony Blair and New Labour. And this is absolutely crucial for the diagnosis phase of the book. Murray looks at the British Conservative Party, and he sees a patient on life support.
He says they were flatlining, right? I remember that quote.
Yes. And we have to analyze the incentive structure here. Why are they flatlining? Murray's argument is that after that massive historic defeat in 1997, the conservatives panicked. They looked at the political marketplace and decided the only way to survive was to mimic the market leader.
So they just tried to become Tony Blair.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They looked at the incentives in the system and decided the only viable path was to copy the left. Murray argues they actually entered socialist territory. High spending, a lot of big state intervention. But most importantly, he says they adopted the institutionalized political correctness of the era.
So they were trying to be New Labour-like.
Right. And structurally, Murray argues this was a catastrophe.
Yeah.
Because by chasing the center, which he would argue had actually moved significantly to the left, the conservatives vacated the field.
They left the goal wide open.
Completely. There was no one left in mainstream politics to argue against what Murray calls the forces of countercultural degradation.
It's an interesting evolutionary failure, isn't it? Like an organism adapts to its environment to survive, but Murray is saying the Conservative Party adapted so much they ceased to be conservative.
That's a perfect way to put it. They evolved into their predator.
Mm.
And this brings us to the first major systemic concept of the book, the distinction he makes between a nation in flux and a nation in drift.
I highlighted this section heavily. It feels like a very useful mental model for any organization, really, not just a country.
It is. It's fundamental. Murray acknowledges that flux is natural. Change happens. He's not against change. He quotes the leopard. If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change.
Right, that's a classic.
So a healthy system is in flux. It adapts while keeping its core identity. It bends so it doesn't break.
But drift is different.
Drift is fatal. Drift implies you are moving without a destination. You're not even steering. You're moving because you've lost the friction to stop.
You're just being carried along.
Exactly. And Murray borrows a very evocative word from the poet W.B. Yeats to describe this. He says the West is slouching.
Slouching towards Bethlehem. That's the famous line.
Precisely. And just think about the posture of slouching. It's lazy, it's unengaged, it's a collapse of the spine. Murray argues the system, our society, is moving toward danger, not because it actively chose danger, but because it is too exhausted and too confused to resist it.
It's a loss of civilizational confidence.
That's the term. It's a deep systemic fatigue.
So what is the mechanism of this slouch? What's the gravity that's pulling us down into that posture?
The mechanism is relativism. This is the main villain of the book. He calls it the tyranny of relativism.
We hear that word a lot. Everything is relative. But he's using it in a very specific structural way here.
He is. He's not just talking about, people having different opinions. He argues that modern liberalism as a system abandoned its absolutist basis, meaning the idea that some things are objectively true and good for entirely relativistic ones.
And the outcome of that isn't just, we all get along and hold hands and respect each other.
No, and this is the key system design flaw he identifies. Murray points out that when you adopt total relativism, intolerance appears as a value equal in dignity to tolerance.
Okay, let's pause on that for a second. That's a paradox.
It is the central paradox. It's a logic bomb at the heart of the system. If I say all cultures are equal and then I meet a culture that says we hate you and we want to destroy you, I am structurally paralyzed.
You're stuck.
I cannot say my culture of tolerance is better than their culture of hatred, because to do so would be a value judgment. And value judgments are forbidden in a purely relativist system.
So you disarm yourself. You throw away your shield because you don't want to offend the person who is actively trying to stab you.
That is the argument in a nutshell. And Murray uses a shocking, really visceral example to stress test this idea. He talks about cannibalism.
Yes. I remember reading this and thinking, okay, we went from parliamentary politics to eating people very, very quickly. Why does he go to such an extreme?
He does it to show the fragility of the system. He's pushing the logic to its breaking point, he asks. In a purely relativistic society, why don't we eat people?
Well, because it's wrong. It's monstrous. It's a fundamental taboo.
Murray would ask, according to whom? If there is no God, no natural law, no absolute moral framework, then wrong is just a matter of opinion. It's a social construct.
So he's saying our only defense against something as horrific as cannibalism is?
Dull and stale habit, that's the exact phrase he uses. We don't eat people because we currently aren't in the habit of eating people. It's just a fashion. It's the current custom.
But customs change. Fashions change all the time.
Exactly. And that is the terror Murray is trying to evoke. If the drift of society, for whatever reason, moved towards accepting cannibalism, maybe it gets framed as extreme recycling or radical protein sustainability or some other nonsense, a relativist has no hard ground to stand on to say no.
They can.
They can only say, well, it's not for me personally.
Yeah.
They cannot say it is evil.
That's a dark thought. But I see the utility of the argument. He's saying that without a moral anchor, society is just this boat floating on a sea of habit, and the tide can turn at any moment.
Precisely. And he argues that our political class knows this on some level, but they're incentivized to do nothing about it. The incentive structure of the British political system at the time rewarded ambiguity.
Right.
If you take a hard stand on values, you alienate people. You might lose votes. So the whole system optimizes for inoffensiveness.
Which creates a vacuum.
A huge vacuum where values used to be. And Murray argues that the traditional conservatives, he calls them the paleoconservatives, were useless here Their response to the drift was just nostalgia. Oh, things were better in the 50s.
Which helps nobody. You can't go back.
Right. Murray completely rejects this. He says you can't rewind the clock. The status quo has been corrupted. So to be a conservative now, you can't just conserve, you have to revolutionize.
Yeah.
But before we get to the solution, we have to understand the source code, the intellectual inheritance.
We have to talk about the philosophers, and specifically the man who is so often painted as the boogeyman of the right, Leo Strauss.
The sinister godfather. It is amazing how much lore surrounds Leo Strauss. There's this whole idea that he was running some kind of secret cabal from the University of Chicago, teaching his students to lie to the masses and take over the world.
Like a philosophical mafia.
Yeah, a little bit. Murray spends a good chunk of the book dismantling this. He argues that if you actually sit down and read the texts, Strauss wasn't a puppet master. He was a diagnostician. He was analyzing the crisis of liberalism.
So what was the diagnosis? What was the sickness he saw?
It goes right back to that tension we were just talking about between natural right and diversity. Strauss argued that liberalism has a fatal flaw, a self-destruct mechanism.
Which is?
When liberals prioritize diversity over natural right, when they prioritize the mere existence of different viewpoints over the truth of those viewpoints, they lose the ability to defend their own system.
Because if you say, our system of liberty is the best, you are, by definition, discriminating against systems of tyranny.
Exactly, and that's a huge sin in a relativist framework. Strauss saw that if liberalism abandons the idea of absolute truth, it ends up unable to say tyranny is bad. It opens the door and says, come on in, destroy us because we respect your right to be different. Strauss argued this leads inevitably to the collapse of the liberal order.
And then we have Alan Bloom, who wrote The Closing of the American Mind. I remember that book being absolutely huge in the 80s.
It was a massive cultural moment. Bloom was a student of Strauss, and he basically took these high-level philosophical ideas and applied them to the American university system. He was looking at the machine on the ground floor.
And what did he find?
He identified a systemic paradox in modern education. The system teaches openness as the highest virtue. You must be open to everything.
Which sounds great on the surface. Keep an open mind, it's what we tell our kids.
But Bloom found a glitch in the code. He argued that if you are open to everything, you cannot say one thing is better than another. Your mind becomes closed to the pursuit of truth because you have already decided that truth is just a relative opinion.
It's like being so open-minded your brain falls out.
That's the colloquial way of putting it, yes. And Bloom had this absolutely devastating insight about fear. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, the danger they have been taught to fear from absolutism is not error, but intolerance.
Wait, let's unpack that. That's really important. They aren't afraid of being wrong. They are afraid of being mean.
They're afraid of being judgmental. In this system he's describing, the worst sin isn't lying or being incorrect or even being evil. The worst sin is judging someone else. And that fear dictates the entire behavior of the system.
So it creates a generation that is intellectually paralyzed because they are terrified of making a value judgment.
Terrified. And so neoconservatism enters the chat as the synthesis of these ideas.
It's the proposed antidote.
Yes. Murray argues that neoconservatism combines this Straussian warning about civilizational suicide with something called moral realism. This comes from the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. And it's the simple, stark acknowledgement that evil exists.
Real evil, not just misunderstood evil or evil from a certain point of view.
Correct. Neoconservatism argues that evil is a real force in the world, and you need a hierarchy of values to fight it. You have to be able to stand up and say, freedom is better than slavery, democracy is better than autocracy, and we are willing to fight for that distinction.
So we've got the politicians paralyzed by incentives and the philosophers warning about the collapse of truth. But how does this filter down to the regular person? Murray points a very large, very accusatory finger at the media.
Oh, absolutely. The media ecosystem is, in Murray's view, the primary transmission belt for this virus of relativism.
Oh.
And again, you have to look at the incentives. What is the media incentivized to do?
Well, sell papers, get clicks, get ratings.
Yes, but how? What's the mechanism? Murray argues they do it through symbolic moral positioning. The media positions itself as the moral arbiter of society. They decide who is good and who is bad.
But he's saying they don't have the qualifications for that job.
He argues they lack the philosophical foundation or the accountability to actually do that job properly. They've taken the role of the priest, but without the theology.
He has this great image, this very cutting image of the pajamas journalists.
Yes, it's a very specific, very British burn. He talks about a BBC journalist sitting in his pajamas, or at least appearing to be that casual and comfortable, while accusing a prime minister of lying to the nation.
It's the lack of deference that bothers him, the lack of respect for the office.
It's more the unearned moral superiority. It's the performance of it. And this connects to what he calls the outsider delusion.
The outsider delusion? What's that?
It's this dynamic where the most privileged insiders in our society act like they're dangerous outsiders. You have these media elites who are arguably the most powerful people in the culture. They shape the entire narrative. But they pretend to be rebels. They pretend to be fighting the man.
Even though they are the man.
They are the man. That's his whole point. They are the ones enforcing the dominant countercultural consensus while they're pretending to be brave dissidents fighting it.
And he brings up the cartoons of the era.
Yes, the political cartoons.
Yeah.
You'd open a major broadsheet newspaper, a respectable paper, and you would see George W. Bush or Tony Blair depicted as Nazis or as genocidists.
I remember those. They were everywhere. It was a common visual trope.
And Murray asks us to look at the system error there. Just analyze what's happening. You have a democratically elected leader fighting a brutal tyranny, a regime under Saddam Hussein that used chemical weapons on its own people. And the media in the free world portrays the Democrat as the tyrant.
That is the crisis of perception in action. It's a total inversion of reality.
It's a funhouse mirror. And this feeds the relativism, right? It turbocharges it. If the media, the trusted arbiters of truth, tell you that your own democratic leaders are just as bad as the dictators they are fighting, then why would you support your own side?
You wouldn't. You would drift. You'd disengage. You'd say a plague on both your houses.
And you'd slouch. Which brings us to the sharp end of the stick, foreign policy. Because if you can't judge evil at home, you certainly can't summon the will to fight it abroad.
Right. Foreign policy is the system output. It's the final product of all these internal calculations and miscalculations.
Exactly. And the neoconservative input for foreign policy is heavily influenced by, of all people, Thucydides.
The ancient Greek historian, the Peloponnesian War guy.
That's the one. Murray cites Pericles' funeral oration. And the lesson he draws isn't about military tactics, about phalanxes or ships. It's about the spirit to meet the foe. It's about civilizational morale.
Okay.
Murray argues that a world that is in drift needs to be moored. It needs an anchor. And the only way to moor it is by drawing clear, unambiguous lines between friends and enemies.
This is the intellectual bedrock of the Bush doctrine, isn't it? You're either with us or you're with the terrorists.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
We have to map the logic chain here. It starts with an idea from Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, this belief that liberal democracy is the best and final form of government possible.
The ultimate system.
The ultimate system. But that order is under threat. It's under threat from nihilism, from tyranny, from Islamist extremism. So the system output must be proactive intervention.
You can't just sit back and provide defense. You can't wait to be hit again. You have to go out and secure the order.
Right. And here's where the moral absolute comes in. President Bowen had a very famous quote, which Murray highlights. Different circumstances require different methods, but not different moralities.
That is a profoundly anti-relativist statement.
It is the manifesto of the whole movement. It says, torture is wrong in London and is wrong in Baghdad. Freedom is right in New York, and it is right in Kabul. Cultural differences are not an excuse for moral atrocities. The morality is universal.
Now, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the noble lie. Because when people hear neoconservatism and Iraq, they immediately think we were lied to. They think about weapons of mass destruction. They think about this accusation that these Straussians believe in deceiving the public for their own good.
This is, without a doubt, the most controversial part of the legacy, and Murray addresses it head-on. He doesn't shy away from it. He calls the noble lie accusation a calumny, a malicious smear.
So he just denies it.
He argues that the neocons do not believe in lying to the public. In fact, his defense is fascinating because he flips the accusation completely on its head.
How so?
He argues the problem with the Iraq War narrative wasn't deception. It was too much transparency.
Hold on, wait a minute. You're telling me his argument is the problem was they were too honest? That sounds, well, frankly, it sounds like spin.
It sounds completely counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But you have to look at the system dynamics he's describing. The U.S. and U.K. governments released massive, unprecedented amounts of raw intelligence to the public to justify the war.
Right, the dossiers.
The satellite photos. They put Colin Powell on international television with a prop vial of what was supposed to represent anthrax.
They showed their homework to the world.
They did. But here's the problem. Intelligence is messy. It is fragmentary. It is probabilistic. It is almost never 100% certain. By dumping all this raw, uncertain data on the public, they invited the public to audit a decision that was being made under immense pressure and with incomplete information.
They were trying to satisfy a public demand for total knowledge.
A very liberal, modern demand.
Yeah.
And when that data turned out to be flawed, when the WMDs weren't found where they thought they'd be.
The public screamed, liar.
But Murray argues it wasn't a calculated lie. It was a system error. The government tried to be open, that liberal virtue again, in a situation where, he argues, traditional statecraft would have called for discretion.
So what's his alternative? What would a true conservative leader have done? Said nothing.
They would have said less. They would have said, essentially, I have access to information you do not. The threat is real. I am the leader. Trust my judgment.
Which requires a level of deference, a level of trust in institutions that simply doesn't exist anymore.
Correct. It's gone. And Murray argues that the accusation of a lie is actually a psychological tool used by the relativist system. It is much easier and more comfortable to believe Blair lied than to face the terrifying reality that Saddam was a monster, the intel was murky, we were all scared, and we had to make a horrific choice with no good options.
Calling it a lie simplifies the moral complexity into a simple scandal. It lets us off the hook from having to think about the hard choices.
It makes it a story about a bad man, not a broken system.
Let's bring this back home then. Because Murray insists you can't separate foreign policy from domestic policy. He calls them nested systems.
This is his interconnection analysis.
Yeah.
And it's vital. You cannot be a lion abroad and a lamb at home. It doesn't work. They're outputs of the same moral software. If your software is corrupted by relativism in London, it will crash when you try to run a complex intervention in Basra.
And at home, how does this crisis of perception manifest? He says it's an imbalance of rights over responsibilities.
Yes, and he's very critical of the welfare state here. Again, it comes down to an incentive analysis. He argues that the modern state has, with the best of intentions, severed the link between action and consequence.
Can you give me a specific example he uses?
He uses the example of teenage pregnancy. Now, it's a very sensitive topic, but look at the systemic argument he's making. If the state guarantees housing and income to a teenager who gets pregnant, regardless of their personal circumstances or ability to support the child, the state has effectively removed the dissuasive consequence.
It has subsidized the behavior it claims it wants to reduce.
That's the cold systems level logic. But more deeply, Murray argues it treats people as victims of their environment rather than as moral agents. The system says, you couldn't help it. Society did this to you. NeoConservatism says, no, you are a free adult. You made a choice, and freedom requires the responsibility to own the consequences of that choice.
It sounds harsh. It's a harsh message.
It is harsh. But Murray argues it is the only way to treat people with real dignity. To treat them as adults capable of making choices, not as, pets of the state.
And this flows directly into the issue of multiculturalism. This is probably the most explosive part of the book, even today.
It is. Because Murray views multiculturalism not just as a demographic fact, people from different places living together, but as an ideology. He calls it an anti-Western ideology.
How does he justify that? That's a strong claim.
He argues there's a glitch in the liberal elite mindset regarding immigration. Because of relativism, because they cannot stand up and say British culture is distinct and valuable and worth preserving, they cannot find a logical reason to deny entry to anyone.
Even people who openly hate the West and its values.
Exactly. If all cultures are equal, on what basis do you say you can't come in? And Murray points out the profound one-way morality of it all.
What do you mean by one way?
We in the West are required to respect all other cultures. We must be tolerant. We must adapt. But there is no expectation of reciprocity.
He mentions Saudi Arabia as the counterexample.
Right. There is zero religious freedom in Saudi Arabia, zero tolerance for diversity. Yet the West is told it must be endlessly tolerant of Saudi intolerance. Murray's question is simple. Is this a suicide pact?
Tolerance as a suicide pact.
If you tolerate the intolerant, eventually the intolerant will destroy you and your tolerance along with it. And this, for Murray, leads to the identity crisis. A nation that cannot define itself, us, cannot define its enemies, them.
And if you don't know who you are, you won't fight for your survival. You've lost that will to survive he talked about at the beginning.
You will just drift. You'll slouch.
So we have this diagnosis. The system is broken. The software is corrupted. We are drifting toward disaster. Neoconservatism is the proposed patch, the fix. Why does this ideology stick around? Why are we still talking about it 20 years later?
Persistence analysis. This is key. Ideologies endure because they offer coherence under uncertainty. Think about the post-9/11 world. It was terrifying. It was chaotic. Nothing made sense.
Hmm.
Neoconservatism came along and offered a hierarchy of values. It offered moral clarity.
It told people what was up and what was down, what was good and what was bad.
Exactly. When the world feels like it's falling apart, a doctrine that says, we know the truth and we will fight for it, gains massive structural traction. It organizes the chaos into a clear story.
And this leads to the final paradox. The revolutionary conservative, I love this term, it sounds like a contradiction.
It explains the energy of the movement. Traditional conservatism, the paleo-conservative kind, is about keeping things the same. It's about standing athwart history yelling, stop.
Right. Conserving the status quo.
But Murray asks, what if the status quo is already broken? What if the status quo is leftist, relativist, and suicidal?
Then conserving, it means conserving the disease. You're just managing the decline.
Correct. So to be a conservative now, Murray argues, you must be a revolutionary. You must actively overthrow the current drift to restore what you see as the natural path.
That explains the neo in neoconservatism. It's not old, it's new.
It is active, it is optimistic, it is interventionist, it isn't old men grumbling in a club about how things used to be. It is a movement that wants to go out and reshape the world according to its values.
So to summarize the entire system as he lays it out, the crisis isn't just bad politics or a few bad decisions. It's a systemic failure to perceive reality, and that failure is caused by the virus of relativism that has infected our core institutions.
And neoconservatism, as presented in this book, argues that survival requires the reinstitutionalization of judgment. It argues that we must be willing, as a civilization, to distinguish good from evil, and then have the courage to back that judgment with conviction and, if necessary, with force.
It is a deeply provocative argument, and it leaves us with a massive question to chew on, one that feels even more relevant now than it did in 2005.
It really does.
So here's the thought for you, the listener, to take away. If our institutions are designed to avoid value judgments in order to keep the peace, does that very design inevitably invite conflict and even war from those who do have strong absolute values? Is tolerance a suicide pact if it tolerates the intolerant?
That is the question that haunts this entire book. And looking around the world today, it is a question that clearly has not gone away.
A huge thank you to Douglas Murray and his book, Neoconservatism, Why We Need It for providing the fuel for this deep dive.
A controversial, but I think an essential text for understanding the architecture of our current crisis. I'd really recommend you get it from a library or, find a copy. It's worth the read.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for listening.